this is the Envisiontech podcast, and I'm your host, Paul Yegan. Today we're going to talk about Epic Games and the things that they're doing to stop blind developers from creating games. Since this is the first episode of the podcast, it's really important that I give you a reason to listen to the podcast, and not only that, but a reason to listen to me specifically. Well, as I mentioned, I'm Paul Geoghegan. I have a computer science degree from the Technological University of Dublin. I've been playing games now for about 20 years, and as I also mentioned, I'm a blind developer. So for quite a while now, I've had a problem with the tech industry, and especially with the game development industry. In order to try and fix some of these problems, I decided to found my own company, because I hoped that maybe I'd be able to make a difference. My company's called Envisiontech, and I founded it late last year. Since then, I've made a lot of progress with learning about accessible web apps and how to make all sorts of different things in an accessible way. So what does accessibility mean? Some disabled people like me use assistive technologies, which help us to access things like computers and phones. For blind people especially, we usually use things called screen readers. Now, there are other options, but screen readers are going to be the main topic here. So a screen reader, as the name would imply, will actually read to you what is on the screen, and then you navigate around using the arrow keys or the tab key. So when I say that something is accessible, it means that it works with my screen reader. And when I say that something isn't accessible, that means that obviously it doesn't work with my screen reader. There's all sorts of different software out there, as I'm sure you know. And as part of game development, you need to use a piece of software called a game engine, for those of you who don't know. A game engine basically just makes it so that you don't have to write all the code for the game. So a lot of the physics and stuff is already made for you. Probably the biggest game engine is one made by Epic Games. Epic Games is a really huge company, and if you haven't heard of them, they make games like Fortnite, which you have probably heard of. So there are a few other game engines out there made by companies like Unity, and there's a few good open source options as well, which basically just means that they're free and that a lot of other people come together to make them. It's not necessarily just one big company. But Epic Games makes a games engine called Unreal Engine, and they're actually on Unreal Engine 5 at the minute. And in order to use Unreal Engine 5, the usual way anyway, is to get it through the Epic Games launcher. Now, you have to download the Epic Games launcher, which obviously, as the name implies, it's usually used for downloading games. But in order to download the Unreal Engine, as I mentioned, you actually need the Epic Games launcher. So I downloaded the Epic Games launcher, and that was obviously fine. It's just a download from their website. But as soon as I opened Unreal Engine, I found a huge problem, and that was that my screen reader didn't work with it at all. And I mean, as soon as I opened it, my screen reader didn't say anything. Now, sometimes I'll come across something that isn't perfect, and maybe my screen reader won't work with all the buttons, or, some of the text won't be read out, but in Epic's case, it literally said nothing, which is a really huge problem. Now, honestly, if I couldn't use the Epic Games launcher, it would have been a bit annoying, but it wouldn't have been a problem because I could just get somebody like my wife to help me download Unreal Engine. So I had her help me do that. And I thought that once I got past that hurdle, everything would be okay. But it turns out that Unreal Engine suffers from the exact same problem. So as soon as I opened Unreal Engine, again, my screen reader said absolutely nothing. The next important question is, well, why does this matter in the first place? So, as I mentioned, I'm blind, but I wasn't always blind, at least not fully. And throughout my childhood, I played a lot of games. So, I know what it's like to be able to play games. And since I've gone more blind, or lost more of my vision, I've played other games that were made for blind people specifically, or that just happen to work with a screen reader. So, because the Epic Games launcher and Unreal Engine both don't work with a screen reader, it means that I actually can't make a game. Now, that might not sound like a big deal, but, usually you would just use something else. So I tried that. I tried out the Unity games engine, and I tried out a few other open source solutions, some bigger ones, some smaller ones. But the conclusion I came to is that no matter which one I used, they all had their problems. Even one that was supposedly accessible, which is called Bevy, which is actually a very cool games engine. It's quite new. So the accessibility implementation is pretty basic at the minute and is actually mainly experimental. It seems like from what I've heard from some of the people who are working on it. And although it is really cool that they're working on that, it's not production ready. The game engine itself and the actual accessibility for it. Now, I suppose another big issue is that Unity is actually another really big company. And yes, I was able to download their Unity Hub after messing around with their website, which wasn't super accessible in itself. And I was able to create a project and do all those basic things. But once I actually got into the part of the engine where I could make my game, again, I ran into problems. I did a lot of research on this, and supposedly Unity are actually working to solve this problem. But at the minute, it's not accessible and I can't make a game. So again, why does that matter? Well, think about it this way. I think it's around 10% of the world are visually impaired. So that's around, 800 million people now at this point? So that is a lot of people. And if even only a fraction of those use a screen reader, let's just say it's, 5 or 10%, that's between 40 million and 80 million people, which, look, it could be much lower than that, but either way, it's in the millions. So that is number one for businesses, millions of potential customers that they're missing out on, and also millions of people who can't do something simple like play chess or any other game, really, which is honestly really sad, because I know that for me throughout my life, playing games has been really fun, and not only that, but has honestly helped me as a person. And yes, there are currently games that blind people can play, even ones that aren't necessarily made for blind people, which is really great and really cool. But honestly, a lot of the features required to make a lot of games accessible are really simple, but developers just don't add them in. Now, this has improved over the years, but it's still not particularly good. So it matters because there's a huge part of the population that can't use these things, and that probably want to. Or at least if they wanted to, they should be able to. And the even bigger problem is that those people can't even fix the problem themselves, because I tried, and you can't. It is, as far as I can tell, impossible for a blind developer to make a game by themselves, or even as part of a team. Honestly, I'm not sure how useful they could be, unless they made their own game engine, which I have considered, and maybe will do, but that would take years, like especially by myself, and it's not even going to be comparable to Unreal Engine. The fact that I can't use these game engines does bother me, but something that bothers me even more is the emphasis that Epic, Unity, and other game engines place on being inclusive and accessible. For example, Epic has many guides on making their games accessible, which is honestly a bit silly that it's not just accessible by default, especially things like menus. And then Unity has a whole inclusivity statement about how they aim to include everybody with a disability, etc., etc., etc. So it is really frustrating when I'm reading so much about all these features that Unreal Engine has that allow games to be accessible. It doesn't seem like many people use them in the first place, and Epic themselves have decided not to make their own platforms or games or game engine accessible. Like, how is that even a thing? How is it possible that these companies are going to pretend like they care, or at least seemingly, and then turn around and actually not even do anything? That, I think, is the most frustrating part for me. I spent ages reading different online documentation and looking into solutions, reading all sorts of forum threads, sending emails, posting requests, posting on forums, And all I've gotten back so far is nothing. Even from Epic, I think it took them a month, if not just a little bit less than that, to respond. And the response I got was, hey, why don't you submit a ticket to request to the developer support? So, just to clarify, in order to do that, I would need to have essentially a subscription with Epic. I would need to enroll in a program that would cost me money. So, in order to even be able to tell them that their engine isn't accessible, they want me to pay. So, they want me to pay for something that I can't even use, in the hopes that maybe they will listen to me and do something about it, which honestly, I'm not sure if that will happen. Now, since then, I've said that to them, and I got an email just before I started recording this, actually, about them escalating it to somebody else and that they would keep me updated. But it's been 2 months now since I submitted that initial request, and I haven't actually heard anything besides you pay us money and we might respond, and then eventually 2 months later them escalating my request. Even I posted on Reddit, and all I got back was somebody telling me to maybe ask some of the developers, and that's about it, because as far as I can tell, there's nobody who knows about this properly anyway, and there's no actual solution. So, what is the solution here? Well, as I mentioned, developers like me could come together and make a game engine, but in reality, is it going to be better than Epic's? Probably not. They're a huge company and they have so many employees working on this and getting paid to do it. Nobody's going to pay me to make a game engine when there's already so many, especially when it doesn't seem like the industry cares that much in the first place. So, in order to fix this problem, all that I can really do is reach out to Epic and say, hey, you guys need to do better, and hopefully that they listen. Now, I'm not saying that I won't make my own game engine, because maybe I will. And you know what? Maybe it will end up being really good. But I just can't guarantee that. I might work on it for 3 years and then realize that it's too much work, or by the time that I've finished mine, Epic will already have released another version of the Unreal Engine, and well, then mine will be obsolete. So it's hard to say, because there is a graveyard of game engines that were made and just never went anywhere. There are even game engines that were made specifically for games made for blind people. And as far as I can tell, all those companies and engines are gone, because that's not what we need. We don't need a game engine that lets people make games specifically for blind people or for any people with disabilities, really. We just need a game engine that makes games. And as part of that, those games should be accessible. And I don't think that is too big of an ask. Because honestly, there are maybe some games that can't be accessible, and I totally understand that, but even then, maybe they could be. I don't know. But a lot of games currently can be. Even a lot of games could introduce audio cues, that are either on by default, and don't really interfere with the gameplay at all. People wouldn't really question it. I know for me and my wife, we play Nintendo Switch Sports sometimes, and for example, in tennis, I can hear the ball hit the court before I have to swing. And that means that I can play that game, but there's some problems with that. Even with that, I don't know when I'm going to go off the court, like out of bounds. But they could really easily fix that. They could have something in the game already that people who can see wouldn't even question, and it wouldn't seem out of place. Or they could have something that you can turn on that would let you do that, and might say, I don't know, that you're getting close to the edge or whatever. I'm not sure exactly what the solution would be because I didn't make the game. But there are so many games where it would be really, really simple. And obviously then there are more advanced things like having specific features that are made just for people who can't see or whatever it might be. But it does seem like there are some games that have done this, that might have narrators for their menus. Or even in a few games, I believe they actually are quite accessible for blind people, even though they are really big AAA games that maybe people wouldn't think of them being accessible. So in conclusion, it's really important that these big studios are held accountable for doing things like making games accessible. And not only that, but making the game engines that they use accessible. So all that we can really do for the minute is contact them and say, hey, you need to do better and you should be doing better. Not only just for business sake of getting more customers, but honestly, it is the right thing to do. And in a lot of countries, it's the legal thing to do, or at least it's becoming the legal thing to do. You may have seen lawsuits of companies getting in trouble because their apps haven't been accessible. So hopefully we'll see these big companies be held accountable and make a change. Because currently it's literally impossible for a developer like me who wants to make their own games to do that, which is honestly really sad. And honestly, all it does is harm these big companies because they're missing out on more customers, they're missing out on developers making more games using their engines, which is really, really good for them. So thank you all for listening, and hopefully I will have you back again next time for the next episode. Thank you. Again, I'm your host, Paul Gagan.